I didn't set out to buy a Ouija board. It sort of found me. A few months back, I was helping clear out my late aunt's house. A massive, decrepit old Victorian. She'd lived alone for years, so the place was stuffed to the brim with antiques and junk. It was during my third day there, rummaging through the dust-laden attic, that I stumbled upon it. The board was in a carved wooden box, tucked away behind some moldy books. It wasn't one of those cheap, mass-produced ones. This thing looked ancient. The wood was warped, the planchette was hand-carved, and strange symbols ran along the edges. Symbols I couldn't recognize, even after a late-night dive into internet forums. A faint sense of unease curled in my gut when I touched it, but curiosity overpowered caution. I brought it home. It sat in my living room for weeks, mostly ignored. But the nights when I couldn't sleep, that's when I'd find myself staring at it. One restless Friday, after a couple of drinks, I decided to give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen? I lit a few candles, dimmed the lights, and placed my hands on the planchette. Is anyone there? I whispered, feeling ridiculous. Nothing happened, just silence and the flicker of the candlelight. I was ready to pack it up when the planchette shifted under my fingers. A chill raced up my spine. It moved slowly, deliberately to yes. My breath hitched as I stared at the board. I wasn't pushing it, I swear. My hands were barely touching the planchette. Who are you? I stammered, my voice shaky. The planchette began to glide, faster this time. My fingers struggled to keep up. E-L-I-A-S. Elias. The name hung in the air like a weight pressing on my chest. Okay, Elias, I muttered, trying to calm the sudden pounding in my ears. What do you want? The planchette didn't hesitate. F-R-I-E-N-D. My body went cold. It wasn't just the word, it was how the room felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, like a storm building inside the house. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, flickering as the candles sputtered. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A trick of the light, I told myself, but I couldn't stop glancing at the darkened corners of the room. Why me? I asked, barely above a whisper. This time, the planchette moved so violently I almost lost my grip. Y-O-U-B-O-U-G-H-T-M-E. I didn't buy you, I protested, my voice cracking. I found you. The flames of the candles rose suddenly, their light casting strange, twisting shadows against the walls. My heart slammed against my ribs. The planchette spelled another word. D-E-B-T. What debt? I shouted, slamming my fists on the table. What are you talking about? The answer was immediate and chilling. S-O-U-L. No, I said, shaking my head like a child refusing to hear a ghost story. This is a joke. You're just some spirit trying to mess with me. Right? The candles went out. Complete darkness swallowed the room. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I groped for my phone, my lighter. Anything to bring light back. But the second I reached for the Ouija board, the candles reignited on their own. Except now they burned blue. Elias, I said, my voice trembling. What do you mean, soul? The planchette darted across the board, faster than before. I almost couldn't read it. T-H-E-Y-A-R-E-C-O-M-I-N-G. Who's coming? I shouted, standing so fast I knocked over my chair. A knock sounded at the front door. I froze. It wasn't an ordinary knock. It was slow, deliberate. 3 heavy thuds. My skin prickled. I glanced at the clock. 2:33 a.m. No one should have been at my door. Elias, I whispered, my voice shaking. Who is it? The planchette moved with purpose. D-O-N-O-T-O-P-E-N-I-T. I was rooted in place, my eyes darting between the board and the door. Another knock, louder this time, made me jump. Then I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, muffled but clear. "Please, let me in. I need help." I backed away from the door. Something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, to listen to Elias. But the voice sounded so human, so desperate. "Please," the voice cried again. "It's cold out here. I'm hurt." My legs shook as I approached the door. Against every instinct, I reached for the lock. My hand hovered there. Then Elias spelled out 2 words. T-O-O-L-A-T-E. I stopped. Too late for what? The door slammed open, and the candles went out again. The door didn't just open. It flew inward, slamming against the wall with enough force to shake the house. A gust of freezing air whipped through the room, snuffing out the blue flames. But there was no one standing in the doorway. At least, not at first. Shadows began to stretch across the threshold, long and clawed, twisting in impossible shapes. The air crackled, thick with a static charge that raised every hair on my body. My lungs felt heavy, like I was trying to breathe underwater. Then I saw her. She stepped into the room, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. Her body didn't move like a person's. It was jerky, like a broken marionette being forced to perform. Her head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were black pits, glistening like oil. "Help me," she croaked, her voice a rasp that no longer sounded human. "Please." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My legs felt welded to the floor. The woman thing took another step closer, her bare feet leaving behind wet, inky footprints that sizzled against the wooden floorboards. Behind me, the Ouija board started vibrating. The planchette skittered across the board on its own, spelling out a frantic message. G-E-T-O-U-T. The creature's head snapped toward the board, and a guttural growl erupted from its throat. With horrifying speed, it lunged at the table. Its claws, or what used to be hands, ripped through the air, scattering the board and planchette across the room. The symbols on the edges of the board began to glow faintly, like they were fighting back. "Elias!" I screamed, backing into a corner. "What do I do?" The planchette, lying on its side near the overturned table, twitched and spelled out a single word. "Are you in?" The woman, or whatever she was, snapped her gaze back to me. Her jaw unhinged, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Her scream was deafening, a sound that rattled my bones and pierced straight into my skull. I bolted. I sprinted toward the back door, my socks slipping on the hardwood as I fumbled for the latch. Behind me, I could hear her, it following, not running, dragging, that awful, wet scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard, but heavier, more deliberate. "Please," she called again, her voice twisting, shifting from the woman's earlier cry to something deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "Don't leave me. Don't you want to help?" I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the backyard. The freezing night air bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed distance, space, anything to get away from that thing. The yard stretched into a dense patch of woods, and without thinking, I ran toward the tree line. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, the sound of dragging grew louder. She wasn't just following, she was gaining. I made it into the trees, but the darkness was suffocating. My phone was still in the house, the candles and lights far behind me. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the branches. "Run all you want," her voice hissed, slithering through the shadows. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "It won't matter. You're mine." A cold, slimy hand shot out from the darkness and grazed my shoulder. I screamed, stumbling forward and crashing into the underbrush. I twisted to look behind me. She was there, crouched low like an animal. Her limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, her head cocked to one side as though she was studying me. Her black, empty eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The Ouija board's final warning echoed in my head. Run. I scrambled to my feet and kept moving, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The sound of dragging was joined by another noise now, a wet, guttural laugh that turned my stomach. And then I saw it. A light. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough. I forced my legs to keep moving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter as I drew closer, and for a moment, hope flared in my chest, until I saw what it was. The Ouija board. It was lying in the dirt, the symbols along its edges glowing faintly. The planchette was there too, upright and still. How? I'd left it behind. No, I whispered, backing away. This isn't real. This can't be real. The woman appeared again, stepping into the circle of light cast by the board. Her grin stretched impossibly wide, and she raised a hand to point at the board. Your turn, she said, her voice dripping with venom. The planchette began to move on its own. No, I whispered again, shaking my head as the planchette skittered across the glowing board. I'm not doing this. The woman, or whatever she was, didn't reply. She simply stood there, her limbs bent grotesquely, her empty eyes locked on me. The planchette moved faster, spelling out words that I could barely bring myself to read. P-L-A-Y. I stumbled backward, desperate to put more distance between me and the board. My back hit the rough bark of a tree, and for a moment, I felt trapped, pinned between the thing in front of me and the suffocating dark woods behind me. No, I shouted, finding a flicker of defiance. You don't control me. The planchette stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then her head snapped toward me, her grin twisting into something far worse, a sneer filled with razor-sharp malice. You brought me here, she hissed, her voice layering itself over Elias's name like a broken radio. You opened the door. I didn't know. I started, but she cut me off with an ear-splitting scream that made my knees buckle. The ground around the Ouija board cracked, glowing with an unnatural light. Roots twisted up from the earth, coiling around the board as though trying to pull it back into the ground. The symbols flared brighter, pulsing in time with my racing heart. The planchette moved again, spelling something new. S-A-C-R-I-F-I-C-E. My throat went dry. What do you mean? She took a step closer, her jerking movements more unnatural than ever. Her voice was cold now, devoid of the fake pleading from earlier. A debt was owed, a soul was promised. If not yours, then whose? Her clawed hand extended, pointing into the darkness behind me. My heart sank as I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow, hesitant, familiar. Elias, I shouted, spinning around. Elias, help me. But it wasn't Elias. It was my neighbor, a sweet old man who lived 2 doors down. He must have seen my door left open, the candles burning, and come to check on me. He looked confused, holding a flashlight that barely cut through the thick shadows. What's going on out here? He called, his voice shaky. Are you all right? No, I screamed, waving him away. Stay back. But it was too late. The woman, or whatever monstrous thing she truly was, turned her attention to him. Her grin widened, and she darted forward with terrifying speed, her limbs twisting unnaturally as she leapt. No! I screamed, lunging after her, but I was too slow. She was on him in an instant. His flashlight fell to the ground, casting chaotic beams of light as he let out a strangled cry. The roots around the Ouija board surged upward, wrapping around him, pulling him toward the glowing surface. I froze, helpless, as the board's symbols flared one last time. The light intensified, blinding me for a moment. When it faded, the board was gone. The roots had vanished. So had she, and so had he. I stood there in the eerie silence, my knees buckling as the reality of what just happened hit me like a freight train. The woods were still, The air was cold. The only evidence that anything had occurred was the overturned flashlight lying in the dirt. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a familiar voice. "Your turn." The voice froze me where I stood. It echoed through the trees, soft at first, then louder, like it was coming from every direction at once. "Your turn." "No," I croaked, backing away from the sound. My breath fogged the freezing air as I tried to steady my shaking hands. "I'm done." I didn't agree to this, but the woods weren't listening. The flashlight at my feet flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging me into pitch black. I spun around, desperate to orient myself, but the trees all looked the same, shadowy, menacing. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. I didn't want to go toward it. Every instinct screamed at me to run the other way, but I was lost, trapped, and somehow I knew I couldn't leave until I faced it. My legs moved on their own, crunching through the underbrush, step by reluctant step. The glow grew brighter as I approached, and soon I could make out its source. It was the Ouija board. The damn thing had reappeared, lying in a clearing surrounded by a perfect circle of dead, blackened grass. The symbols on its edges pulsed like a heartbeat, and the planchette sat in the center, waiting. I didn't want to touch it, but as I stood there, staring, something shifted behind me. A sound low, guttural, and far too close. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. She was back. Her twisted form emerged from the shadows, her limbs stretched impossibly long, her head tilting from side to side as she crept toward me. Her grin was wider now, impossibly wide, her jagged teeth glinting in the faint light of the board. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "Not until you finish the game." I shook my head violently. "I didn't start this game. I don't want to play anymore." Her laughter was a terrible, wet sound that rattled through the clearing. "It's not about what you want. The board wants what it's owed." The planchette slid across the board, spelling another word. CHOOSE. "What do you mean, choose?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "Choose what?" She pointed at the board, then at me, her clawed fingers slicing through the air like a knife. Her voice dropped to a whisper, icy and venomous. "Choose whose soul pays the debt." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I can't." The planchette moved again, faster this time, spelling out a chilling message: PAYORTHEYALLDIE. Images flooded my mind, my friends, my family, my neighbors, all of them, faces twisted in terror as they were dragged into the same void as my poor neighbor. The woman stepped closer, her oily black eyes narrowing. "Decide," she growled. My hands trembled as I looked at the board, the glowing symbols mocking me. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. Not unless someone else took my place. I can't do this," I whispered. Her grin widened, her voice dripping with sadistic glee. "Then they'll come for all of them, one by one." I stared at the planchette, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My vision blurred, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. Slowly, my hand moved toward the board, shaking violently. "Fine," I choked out. "I'll choose." My hand hovered over the planchette. The glow of the board seemed to pulse in time with the terror coursing through me. Every nerve screamed at me to run, but where would I go? She'd find me, they'd find me. The forest itself felt alive, watching, waiting for me to make the choice. "Choose," she whispered again, her voice curling around me like smoke. Her form seemed to waver, dark and slick, as though she were no longer tethered to the rules of this world. "I can't," I whispered, tears streaking down my face. "Please, there has to be another way." She laughed. A hollow, echoing sound that felt like knives dragging across my skin. "There is no other way. Pay the debt or they'll all suffer." My mind reeled, flipping through every face I knew. My sister, my coworkers, the barista who always smiled at me in the morning. If I didn't choose, this thing would destroy them all. But how could I decide? How could I willingly condemn someone else to this fate? Then I remembered Elias. Why? I blurted out, my voice trembling. Why does Elias care? Why did he save me? The creature froze, its grin faltering for the first time. He didn't save you, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. He tricked you. My stomach turned. What do you mean? She moved closer, her oily black eyes boring into mine. Elias isn't your savior. He's your predecessor. He played the board just like you. And when it came time to pay, he chose you. My blood ran cold. No, that's not possible. The board pulsed brighter, and the planchette spelled out another message. ILWAYSACIRCLE. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. Elias wasn't helping me, he'd set me up. This was the game's cycle. Its twisted, never-ending loop. One soul damns another over and over until the board gets what it wants. Her voice broke through my panic, sharp and cruel. Choose or the circle widens. Everyone you've ever known. Everyone you've ever loved. I had to do something, anything. My gaze darted to the board, then back to her. My hands clenched into fists. If Elias had tricked me, maybe there was a way to end this cycle. What if I don't choose? I asked, forcing my voice to steady. Her grin returned, slow and cruel. Then you'll stay here, forever. The board will keep you, and it will still take them all. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the air growing heavier. My chest burned with the weight of it. My heart screamed for me to pick someone, anyone, and save myself. But deep down, I knew what I had to do. I'll choose, I said quietly, stepping closer to the board. Her grin widened, triumphant. The planchette began to move, waiting for my answer. But instead of pointing to a name or offering up a soul, I grabbed the board. With every ounce of strength I had, I hurled it into the glowing abyss beneath the blackened grass. The creature screamed, a sound so loud and unnatural it felt like it would split my skull. The glowing circle erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the forest around me shook violently. I fell to the ground, covering my ears as the sound and light consumed everything. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was gone. The Ouija board, the glowing symbols, the woman, all of it had vanished. I was lying in my own backyard, the faint glow of the early dawn stretching across the horizon. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind reeling. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I saw it. A faint burn mark on the grass, the shape of the Ouija board etched into the earth. And in the distance, carried on the morning wind, I heard a familiar voice. Your turn. The world around me felt muted in the light of dawn. Birds chirped, the air was crisp, and yet that faint, sing-song voice echoed in the back of my mind. Your turn. I stumbled inside, my legs like jelly, and slammed the door behind me. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. My chest heaved as I scanned the room, expecting to see her, or the board, or some remnant of the nightmare I had just survived. But there was nothing, just my overturned chair, the melted candle stubs, and the faint scorch mark on the floor where the board had been. For hours, I sat in silence, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every flicker of shadow sent my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was over, that destroying the board had broken the cycle. But I couldn't ignore the mark in my backyard, or the voice. That night, I barely slept. I kept every light in the house on, clutching a kitchen knife under the covers like it could somehow protect me. When I did drift off, I dreamed of her. Those black, pitiless eyes, that smile, and the board, glowing in the darkness, waiting for me to play. The next few days were a blur. I called out of work, avoided friends and family, and tried to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But the signs kept piling up. Lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own. My reflection in the mirror lingering just a fraction too long after I'd moved. And then came the package. It arrived one evening, left on my doorstep with no return address. My heart sank as I picked it up. It was heavy, wrapped in brown paper, and smelled faintly of smoke. I didn't want to open it. I knew what was inside, but I had to. My hands shook as I tore away the paper. And there it was, the Ouija board, perfectly intact, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light of my kitchen. The planchette sat neatly on top, as though waiting for me to make my move. A note was tucked inside the box, written in jagged, frantic handwriting. It doesn't end. Pass it on, or it will come for you. Panic gripped me as I shoved the box away, knocking it to the floor. The board slid out, landing face up, and the planchette moved on its own. Slowly, deliberately, H-E-L-P. I screamed, kicking the box away and running to the far corner of the room. But the board stayed there, glowing, taunting me with its silent demand. I didn't know what to do. If I destroyed it, would it truly be gone? Or would I end up like the last person, doomed to suffer, to drag someone else into this nightmare just to save myself? The voice returned, soft and teasing. Your turn. I stared at the board, tears streaming down my face, and made my decision. I stared at the Ouija board lying on the floor, its glowing symbols casting faint, eerie shadows on the walls. The planchette twitched, waiting for me to act. The note's warning echoed in my mind. Pass it on, or it will come for you. How could I doom someone else to this torment? But the alternative, keeping the board, living with its curse, I couldn't survive that. I already felt it creeping into my mind, into my very soul. The shadows were darker, the silence heavier. I could feel her waiting, watching. Your turn, the voice whispered again, closer this time, almost playful. I knew what I had to do. The decision made me feel sick, hollow, but there was no other way. Hands trembling, I packed the board back into its box and wrapped it in the brown paper. My head swam with guilt as I wrote an address. An old coworker I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who wouldn't immediately connect the package to me. I convinced myself it wasn't personal. I wasn't picking them because of who they were, just because they were distant, disconnected from my life. The next morning, I dropped the package off at a shipping center. I avoided the clerk's eyes as I handed it over, my throat tightening with every step I took away from the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd hear the voice again, that I'd see her one last time. But the further I got from the shipping center, the lighter I felt. Maybe I was free. For a week, nothing happened. The house felt normal again. No flickering lights, no voices, no shadows that seemed to stretch and linger. I started to believe I'd done the right thing. The only thing. The nightmares began to fade. My appetite came back. Life resumed its fragile balance. Then, one evening, I got a text. It was from the coworker I'd sent the board to. A photo of the Ouija board, unwrapped, sitting on their kitchen table. The message underneath was short, simple. What the hell is this? Why did you send it to me? I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to tell them not to touch it, to get rid of it. But what would that do? They'd just send it to someone else, wouldn't they? The cycle would continue. Before I could reply, a second text came through. Something just moved. Is this a joke? My blood ran cold. I dropped my phone, staring at it like it might come to life. I didn't want to pick it up again. Didn't want to see what they'd say next. But it didn't matter. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy. And then, from somewhere in the house, I heard it. Soft, familiar, terrifying. Your turn. I froze. The voice wasn't in my head this time. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like it belonged here, as if the very foundation of the house was whispering those two words. Your turn. I forced myself to move, grabbing the nearest object, a knife from the kitchen counter, and clutching it like it would somehow help. My phone buzzed again, lighting up the darkness around me. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. The screen showed another text from the coworker. It won't stop. It's moving on its own. Did you curse me or something? Before I could respond, Another text came through, this one accompanied by a video. Shaking hands, I hit play. The video showed the Ouija board. Its symbols glowed faintly, just like they had in my house. The planchette moved on its own, jerking across the surface. My coworker's voice trembled in the background. Is this a prank? This isn't funny. The screen shook violently as the phone fell, clattering onto what I assumed was their floor. The view now showed only the ceiling. There was a distant scraping sound, followed by a guttural laugh that made my stomach churn. Then silence. The video ended. I dropped my phone, bile rising in my throat. I didn't want to know what happened next. I didn't want to think about what I had done. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air shifted, growing colder. The lights flickered again, longer this time. My own shadow stretched across the room, twisting unnaturally until it didn't look like me at all. Your turn, the voice whispered again, louder now. I spun around, searching the room, but nothing was there. Just the faint hum of electricity and my own ragged breathing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The box. It sat on the kitchen table, the brown paper torn, the Ouija board peeking out from inside. The planchette was already on the board, quivering like it was waiting for me to sit down. No, I whispered, backing away. I sent you away. You're gone. You're gone. The voice laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the room. The game isn't over. Never ends. The box slid across the table toward me, the board spilling out onto the surface. The symbols blazed brighter than before, illuminating the room in an unnatural, pulsing glow. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out one final message. P-A-Y. I don't know what happened next. All I remember is screaming. The lights went out completely, and the room was swallowed by darkness. Something grabbed me, cold, slimy, unrelenting. I fought, clawed, and kicked, but it didn't matter. When I woke up, I was lying on my kitchen floor. The board was gone. The house was quiet again. For a moment, I thought it was over, until I turned my head and saw the scorch mark on the floor. Larger this time, spreading like a stain across the wood. And I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. The game always comes back. I couldn't sleep after that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside felt like a taunt. It wasn't over. How could it be? The scorch mark in the kitchen seemed to grow larger every day, spreading like a malignant tumor across the floorboards. I tried scrubbing it, sanding it, even replacing the wood. But no matter what I did, the mark always came back. And the whispers followed. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct, a constant chant. Your turn, your turn, your turn. I couldn't take it anymore. I was losing my mind. Sleep was impossible. Food tasted like ash. I quit my job, ignored my friends, avoided my family. Every moment of every day was consumed by the board. Even when it wasn't there, I felt it. Watching, waiting. Then one night I made a decision. I drove out of town, far into the countryside, where the roads turned to dirt and the stars burned bright in the black sky. The box was in the passenger seat, wrapped in layers of duct tape and plastic bags. I hadn't dared to open it since that last encounter, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I found a clearing in the woods, miles from the nearest house. The air was cold, and the trees loomed over me like silent sentinels. My hands shook as I grabbed a can of gasoline from the trunk and poured it over the box. This ends here, I muttered, striking a match. I'm done. The flame caught instantly, roaring to life as it consumed the box. I watched as the plastic melted and the wood charred, the symbols burning away into nothing. Smoke rose into the sky, thick and black, but I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. The flames flickered, dimming for just a moment. And then I saw it. Her face. It appeared in the fire, twisted and screaming, her black eyes burning like coals. Her voice cut through the crackling flames, sharp and vicious. You can't end it. You can only pass it on. The fire exploded, sending me stumbling backward. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The box was gone, but the scorch mark was there, etched into the ground, smoldering faintly. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they turned white. When I walked into my house, the smell of smoke hit me immediately. The lights flickered, and sitting on my kitchen table, perfectly intact, was the Ouija board. The planchette moved as I stared at it, frozen in horror. P-A-S-A-S-I-T-O-N. I knew then what it wanted, what it had always wanted. The curse couldn't be destroyed, could only be transferred. I had to choose someone just like Elias had chosen me. If I didn't, it would destroy me, consume me completely, and it wouldn't stop there. I sat down at the table, my hands trembling as I picked up my phone. I sent a text to an old high school friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone far removed from my life. "Hey," I typed, forcing my fingers to move. "I found something weird I think you'd like. Can I send it to you?" The response came almost immediately. "Sure, sounds cool." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my reply. A week later, the board was gone. The scorch mark in my kitchen had faded. The whispers had stopped. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I hear her voice. Faint, distant, but always there. "Your turn." Weeks passed. Life began to regain a fragile sense of normalcy. The board was gone, the shadows receded, and the air in the house felt lighter. I told myself it was over, that I had passed the curse along, just as Elias had done before me. But deep down, I knew better. Started small. The faintest flicker of the lights late at night. A soft tapping on the windows, though the trees outside were still. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia, just the remnants of a trauma I couldn't shake, until I saw the scorch mark again. It appeared one morning, faint at first, barely visible against the kitchen floor. I scrubbed it until my hands were raw, but it wouldn't budge. By nightfall, it was darker, deeper, spreading outward like a stain that wouldn't be contained. And then the whispers returned. "Your turn." I tried ignoring them, but they grew louder, clearer. Sometimes they didn't even wait for the night. I'd hear them in the middle of the day, soft voices threading through the noise of the world, carrying that same, taunting phrase. I wasn't safe. The curse hadn't left me. It was still here, still watching, still waiting. One night, I decided to confront it. "Why?" I screamed into the empty house, my voice breaking. "I did what you wanted. I passed it on. Why are you still here?" The answer came in a voice that wasn't hers. It was familiar, low, broken, and trembling. "Elias." I froze. The name echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a cruel joke. And then, slowly, I heard footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I turned, and there he was, Elias, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and gaunt, his face sunken and pale. His eyes were the same black pits I'd seen in her, glistening with a malevolent light. He grinned, his teeth sharp and jagged, his voice a hollow rasp. "You think you're free?" he said, stepping closer. "You think you can just pass it on and walk away?" I backed away, my legs trembling. I followed the rules." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "The rules were never for you. The game doesn't end just because you try to escape. What do you want?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "What do you want from me?" His grin widened, his voice dripping with malice. "It's simple. Play again, or join us." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw them, shapes in the shadows, twisted and wrong. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their eyes glowing faintly as they watched from the corners of the room. They were the others, the ones who hadn't passed it on, the ones who had lost. Elias took another step closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Your turn." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up on the kitchen floor, drenched in sweat, the house deathly quiet. The scorch mark was gone. The whispers had stopped. For now. But I know it's not over. The board will come back, just like it always does. And when it does, I'll have a choice to make. Because the game never ends. And it's always your turn. I knew it couldn't go on like this. The shadows, the whispers, the scorch marks. They weren't just lingering echoes of the curse. They were reminders, warnings. The board hadn't forgotten me, and it never would. Not until I made the final decision. I tried to resist. I blocked out the whispers, ignored the lights flickering, even when they left me in total darkness. But the board had a way of worming its way back into my life. One day, it appeared in the corner of my bedroom, propped against the wall like it had always been there. The planchette sat on its surface, tilted slightly, as if waiting for me to sit down. I thought about destroying it again, but I knew better now. The fire hadn't worked. Burying it hadn't worked. No matter what I did, the board would come back. And every time, the scorch marks would spread wider, the whispers would grow louder, and the darkness would creep closer. There was no escaping it. One last time, I sat down at the table, the board laid out in front of me. My hands trembled as I placed them on the planchette. The symbols on the board glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "What do you want?" I whispered. The planchette began to move immediately, spelling out a single word. CHOICE. I can't, I choked, tears spilling down my face. I can't do this again. Please. The room grew colder, the lights dimming until the only illumination came from the board. The planchette moved again, faster this time. YOUMUST. My mind raced, searching for some way out, some loophole I hadn't thought of before. But there was nothing. The game was always the same. Pass it on or pay the price. And then, in the flickering light of the board, I saw them. The others. Twisted figures lurking in the shadows, their empty eyes fixed on me. Elias was among them, his face a mask of rage and despair. They didn't speak, but their presence was enough. I could feel their hunger, their need to drag me into the darkness with them. I couldn't let that happen. Not to me. Not yet. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. My vision blurred with tears as I searched for someone, anyone, who wouldn't see it coming. Someone distant, someone disconnected. I found a name, a coworker from years ago, someone I hadn't spoken